Hey, seventh grade. So, we're going to find out what happened to Ben when we left off. He had just been attacked by soft parts Doreen. Chapter 16. On the morning of the 8th day of the opening, the royal yacht set off from the island bound for the secret cove. Not only was the queen aboard, but the king and several of his courtiers, for he understood now that the queen had to get as close as she could to the place where the prince would appear, if he appeared at all. 2 days had passed since the cheerful message from the witch, and still there was no sign of their son. All along the king had tried to comfort his wife, but now even he was finding it hard to be brave. Down below, a special cabin had been prepared for the wailing nurses. They had begged to be allowed to come along, but since they hadn't washed for 9 years, they had to be kept well away from the other passengers. With them had come a new crate of bananas, because the first batch had become overripe, and the queen had managed to smile as she saw it carried aboard, because it meant the triplets at least still hoped. As the royal yacht drew out of the harbor, a second and much larger boat pulled up its anchors, ready to follow. This ship was chartered by people on the island who could not fit onto the king's yacht, but who also wanted to be there for the last day of the opening. Most of these were people who cared very much about the little prince and longed for him to be brought back safely, even now at the 11th hour. But some, just a few, were peevish grumblers, people who wanted to gloat over the old wizard and the loopy fay and the conceited little hag when they came back in disgrace. And there are always such people, even in the most beautiful and best ruled places, who just wanted an outing and a chance to gawp at whatever's going to happen, whether it was good or bad. The royal yacht skimmed over the waves. The charter boat followed more slowly. In their cabin, the nurses wailed and tried to think of ways of punishing themselves, but not for long, because they became seasick, and no one can think of a worse punishment than that. The queen would not go below. She stood leaning over the rails, her long hair whipped by the wind, and over again she said, "Dear God, please let him come. Please let him come. I won't do anything bad again if you only let him come." Poor queen. She never had done anything bad. She was not that sort of person. They had been at sea for only a short time when something happened. The sky darkened, a black thundercloud moved in from the west, and a few drops of rain fell on the deck. Or was it rain? The sailors who had been below hurried up the ladders preparing for a storm. The gulls flew off with cries of alarm, and the dolphins dived. It was not a storm, though, and the swirling blackness was not a cloud. The Sky Yelpers came first, a pack of baying, saucer-eyed dogs racing overhead, dropping their spittle on the deck where it hissed and sizzled and broke into little tongues of flame which the sailors stamped out. But it was the harpies which made the queen sway and the king run to her side. They flew in formation, like geese, with Mrs. Smith at their head and the others in a V shape behind her. Mrs. Green, Mrs. Brown, Mrs. Jones, and Miss Witherspoon. Their handbags dangled from their arms, their varnished talons hung down from their crimpling bloomers, and their unspeakable stench beat against the clean, salty air of the sea. From the charter ship a cheer went up. These were the real rescuers, the proper ones, and about time too. The king and queen had waited till the last possible moment before sending in these frightful women, and there were those who thought they had delayed too long. The harpies flew on, the dogs raced before them. In an hour they would be through the gump. The queen's knuckles whitened on the rail, but she would not faint. She would bear it. "There's nothing to do, my dear, you know that," said the king. The queen nodded. She did know it. There were 24 hours left, only one day. These ghastly creatures were her only hope. Chapter 17. Ben lay on the floor of the summer house, his head pillowed on the wizard's rolled-up cloak. His eyes were closed. His face, in the light of the candles, was deathly pale. Since Hans had carried him out of Aster, he had not stirred. Gerke sat behind him, holding his hand. She had rubbed healing ointment into his scalp, and the bleeding had stopped. The wound was closing, but the deeper hurt, the damage to his brain, was beyond her power to heal. And if he ever came around again, if he lived forever in a coma, or if he died. But no one could bear to think of that. Cord sat still as a stone in the folding chair. He was shivering, but they hadn't been able to stop him giving his cloak to Ben. I'm too old, he thought. I've failed in my mission and brought harm to as brave a child as I shall ever see. Hans was crouched on the steps. His fern seed had gone blotchy, and every so often a moan escaped him. Oi, murmured the giant, oi. If he had followed Ben at once into the dining room, instead of waiting by the prince, he could have prevented this dreadful accident, and he knew that he would never forgive himself. The manhole cover on the path now lifted slowly, and the plodger climbed out, still in his working clothes. Any news? He asked. Has he come around? The wizard shook his head, and the plodger sighed and made his way back into the sewer. Melisande was going to be dreadfully upset. It was well past midnight. In Trottle Towers the servants slept, believing that Ben had already been taken to his new home. The ghost had come to stand round Ben as he lay unstirring, and then had gone back to guarding of the Gump. It was amazing how many people had come to ask after Ben, people who should scarcely have known the boy. Wizards and witches, the banshee who worked in the laundry room of the Astor, the flower fairy who had pinched Mrs. Trottle on the nose. It was extraordinary how many people cared. It was the last day of the opening. They had expected to be back on the island by now, but no one even thought of leaving. Ben had helped them from the first moment they had seen him cleaning shoes in the basement of Trottle Towers. He had seemed at once to belong to them. None of the rescuers dreamt of abandoning him. Audre was not with the others as they clustered around Ben. She had gone off by herself and was sitting by the edge of the lake, wrapped in her long black hair. Ben was going to die. Audre was sure of it. It's my fault, she said aloud. I brought the mistmaker. It was because he went to save the mistmaker that Ben was hurt. The mistmaker lay beside Ben now. Audre had been able to snatch him up when the ogre brought Ben out of the dining room. If Ben woke, he would see the little animal at once and know that he was all right. But he wouldn't wake. No one could lie there so white and still and not be at death's door. And if Ben died, nothing would go right ever again. She could grow an extra toe. She could grow a whole crop of extra toes. She could learn to cough frogs, and none of it would make her happy. Only yesterday her great-aunt had taught her the striking people with baldness spell. But what did that matter now? Hags don't cry, Audre knew that, but nothing now could stop her tears. Then suddenly she lifted her head. Something had happened. Something horrible. An evil stench spread slowly over the grass and crept through the branches of the trees. The roosting birds flew upwards with cries of alarm. A cloud passed over the moon. Running back to warn the others, she saw that they had risen to their feet and were staring at the sky. The smell grew worse. A mouse in the bushes squealed in terror. A needle of ice pierced the warmth of the summer night. And then she came. Her rancid wings fluttered once, twice, and were folded as she came to land. Her handbag dangled from her arm. The frill around the bottom of her bloomers, hugging her scaly legs, was like the ruff on a poisonous lizard. Well, well, sneered Mrs. Smith. Quite a cozy little family party, I see. She opened her handbag to take out her powder puff, and the rescuers fell back. The smell of the harpy's face powder is one of the most dreaded smells in the world. One might think that people who have fallen down on the job so completely would at least show some signs of being sorry. No one spoke. The nail polish on the harpy's ghastly talons, the loathsome hairspray on her permed hair were making them feel dizzy and sick. Candles, flowers, giants, and embroidered braces? Psh! Said Mrs. Smith. She put her claws on Gertie's begonia and tore it out of the ground. Well, you know why I'm here, to tell you that you're finished, demoted, kaput. off the job. I don't know if the king and queen will forgive you, but if they've got any sense, they won't. You're failures. You're feeble. You're pathetic. A disaster. Rescuing a kitchen boy and leaving the prince? Still, the rescuers said nothing. They were guilty of everything the harpy accused them of, for they had put Ben before the prince. Hans had struggled with himself for minutes, but in the end, he and the troll had run back to help Ben and left the true prince of the island in a squelchy heap inside the cake. They had forgotten him. It was as simple as that. And Raymond had come to himself, climbed out, and even now was probably guzzling Knickerbocker glories in his room of the hotel. What's more, they hadn't even thought of going back and having another go at getting him out. All they thought of was carrying Ben away to safety. They weren't fit to be rescuers. The harpy was right. The ghost told me what happened, said Mrs. Smith. And if I were the king and queen, I'd know what to do with you. All that fuss about a common servant boy. He's not a common servant boy. He's Ben, raged Odge. And she took a step backwards as the harpy lifted her dreadful claw and sharpened it once, twice, 3 times against the step. Well, the most useful thing you can do now is keep out of our way, Mrs. Smith went on. Get yourself through the gump and let us finish the job. Gertie put her hand to her heart. She didn't care for Raymond, but the idea of him being carried away in the talons of Mrs. Smith was too horrible to bear. How will you operate? Asked the wizard. That's none of your business. But some of my girls are sussing out the Aster now. There seems to be a helicopter pad. She said no more, but in the distance they could hear the baying of a hellhound, and a screeching voice ordered him to sit. Then the harper flew off, but the evil she had left in the air still lingered. Then from behind them came a young, strong voice. Goodness, said Ben, sitting up and rubbing his head. What an absolutely horrible smell. And I gave you guys a little bit of extra time today because I wanted to finish the chapter too. We'll start on chapter 18 on Monday. Or not Monday, tomorrow. Bye.